Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll take an in-depth look at how affluent millennials are leveraging social media to influence their financial decisions. Specifically, we wanted to understand 3 ideas: how affluent millennials envision the future of the finance industry. Second, how affluent millennials are preparing for their future today. And finally, what affluent millennials are seeking in financial services providers. My name is Manika Tiliyampalam, Head of North America Financial Services Marketing at LinkedIn and lead in this global research study. Before we get into the webinar, I just have a few housekeeping items. The webinar will last about 60 minutes in total, including 10 minutes at the end for questions from you, the audience. Also, your phone lines are muted by default, but if you can use the Q&A box on the right of your screen to ask any questions, we will be answering questions at the end. After the webinar, you will receive an email that will provide you with access to the webinar reading, presentation, and white paper. To join us on Twitter during this webinar, please use the handle @LinkedIn_MKTG and hashtag @LinkedIn_AffluentMillennial as seen on this screen. Today's webinar will include 3 parts, beginning with a presentation of the research, an engaging Q&A with our dynamic panel of experts as we dive deeper into what this research means for financial services providers and affluent millennials, followed by a Q&A from you, the audience. We have, to provide a finance industry perspective, we have Guillermo Morain, Vice President and Head of Global Consumer Content Strategy at Mastercard, and Mark Karasu, Vice President of Marketing at Betterment. Both companies with different business models will provide insight into how they engage affluent millennials on social media and some successes they have seen on social media and LinkedIn. We also have Sachin Reiki, an affluent millennial, entrepreneur, and author of a recent blog post titled, "My Financial Stack as a Millennial." He will provide the affluent millennial perspective on what his generation seeks from financial services providers. We have Donna Sabino, Senior Vice President at Ipsos, the research company we partnered with to conduct this study. Donna founded and leads the youth specialization within Ipsos, a consultancy with emphasis on millennials and post-millennials. And finally, we have Emily Friedman, Senior Global Research Consultant at LinkedIn and research lead for this study. So we have lots of great content and insight for you today, and to kick off our discussion, I will take us through the research. There are 15.5 million of these affluent millennials in the United States alone. They are vital to the United States economy, spending $2 trillion annually across a range of products and services. In addition to the wealth members of this generation are poised to build on their own, they will also be on the receiving end of a massive generational transfer of at least $59 trillion in personal wealth over the next several years. This shift is drastically changing the primary buyer persona of financial services firms around the world, thus forcing massive changes to their business models and marketing strategies. This study helps financial services providers best prepare for these drastic changes. This global study by LinkedIn and Ipsos focused on 9,200 millennial and Gen X internet users across 10 countries and examined the preferences and behaviors impacting the financial decisions of affluent millennials, that is, those with more than $100,000 in investable assets, excluding real estate. Millennials are defined as individuals between the ages of 18 to 34. Gen Xers are defined as individuals between the ages of 35 to 49. This study and webinar focuses on 1,507 responses from the United States. It reveals valuable insights firms can use now to begin appealing to this powerful digital generation and capture their loyalty long into the future. The study is comprised of 3 pillars. First, how affluent millennials envision the future of the finance industry. Second, how affluent millennials are preparing for their future today. And finally, what affluent millennials are seeking in financial services providers. For the first pillar, there are 4 ways in which affluent millennials envision the future of the finance industry. Affluent millennials are more likely to think that there will be a cashless society, banks will no longer be their primary financial institutions, and there will be a sharing-based economy. While more than half of both affluent groups anticipate another financial crisis, affluent millennials are significantly more likely to be confident in the future economic growth and believe the American dream is definitely possible. The reason for this high confidence is due to affluent millennials having different tools to help them deal with their finances and a financial crisis when one occurs. Affluent millennials are disciplined and future-oriented. 72% agree that sacrifices they make now will pay off in the future, whereas only about half of all other groups surveyed agreed with this perspective. And finally, affluent millennials set ambitious goals for their lives. We see the goals varying by life stages, but affluent millennials in general tend to be more ambitious. As an example, affluent millennials are 3 times more likely to have a life goal to start a business. So how are affluent millennials starting to achieve all these goals? For the second pillar, there are 4 ways by which affluent millennials prepare for their future now. Affluent millennials are acquiring their assets and managing their life goals by taking out loans. Affluent millennials are significantly more likely to have financial services products that put them in debt. Affluent millennials have credit cards with a balance. They're 7 times more likely to have a business loan, lending to the fact that affluent millennials are entrepreneurs. They are also twice as likely to have a personal loan. They're willing to finance their endeavors to reach their goals. But at the same time, affluent millennials are also really good at saving. More than 1/3 of them put the majority of each paycheck into savings, compared to just 12% of affluent Gen Xers who do the same. Affluent millennials approach their own finances with a greater sense of ownership than previous generations. When it comes to managing their finances, it's clear that affluent millennials want more control. Half are considered soloists, meaning they prefer to do their own research, make their own decisions, and execute trades on their own. Although they want to take the helm when it comes to their finances, affluent millennials don't want to navigate these waters alone. 87% of affluent millennials consider financial advisors important, with 37% calling them a must-have. They want guided, independent expert advice to help them make smart decisions. A striking fact revealed by this study is that affluent millennials are very open to trying financial products and services from brands outside the finance industry. Nearly 7 out of 10 affluent millennials are likely to consider such offerings, compared to just 47% of affluent Gen Xers. While we see this potential deviation exemplified by how quickly affluent millennials adopted NFC mobile payment platforms that are separate from any traditional financial institution platform. While these statistics alone may make financial services brands stand and take attention, there's more. Once affluent millennials become customers of a financial services provider, they remain highly loyal to that brand. This is particularly true for affluent millennials, of whom half say they are very loyal and plan to do more business with their chosen financial services provider. For the final pillar, we take a look at what affluent millennials are seeking from financial services providers. The top 5 factors of unique importance to affluent millennials when choosing a financial institution are the following. Social. Does the company have a strong social media presence? Relationship. Do I already have a relationship with this company? Influence. Do any of my family members use this company? Social presence. Does the company have a positive buzz online? And finally, community purpose. Does the company have a social mission that I agree with? Affluent millennials trust their social networks and turn to them often for financial content, guidance, and advice. We see how important social is when we see that 39% of affluent millennials see social networks as a must-have, which is greater than the overall millennials with 26%. Which is really surprising to us because we generally see this as a generational thing. And on top of that, not only do they see social networks as a must-have, it makes sense. When affluent millennials want all this type of information and content, social networks are central to how they make their financial decisions. Affluent millennials are 3 times as likely to use social networks to inform their decisions and twice as likely to use social networks to seek content from financial companies. While affluent millennials may generally seek out peer opinion, thought leadership content, and product reviews through their social networks, it's important to note that there are no hot topics or particularly successful types of content. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There's just one common thread among all successful content published by financial services providers on social media: personal relevance. While not all affluent millennials necessarily want insights about the same financial topics or answers to the same investing questions, they all do want content that provides solutions and advice that is relevant to them. We see all these behaviors come to life on LinkedIn's platform when we see how connected and how active affluent millennials are when they are sharing a ton of stuff, but the most important is that they're sharing 13 times as much finance topic articles. The financial services providers that acknowledge this impending shift and proactively reach out to the affluent millennial persona will succeed. The firms that meet them within their social networks and deliver products and services, content and communication, and an overall approach that works for them will thrive, not just during the shift, but for generations to come. With the research covered, now let's get into our dynamic panel discussion. Guillermo and Mark, the study revealed that affluent millennials are drastically changing the primary persona of financial providers, thus forcing massive changes to their business models and marketing strategies. Are affluent millennials Mastercard and Betterment's primary target audience? If yes, how have they changed or influenced your company's business model and marketing strategy?
Hello, good morning, everybody. Guillermo Moroni here from Mastercard. I would say it's a very interesting question, and number one, the affluent millennials are not necessarily the primary target for Mastercard. However, having said that, we are focusing specifically on young professionals. So we are taking a portion of the millennials, which most of them are affluent millennials. We have to remember that millennials is a segment that is moving year after year. So in 5 years, they are going to be 40 years old. The ones that are on the high end of the year that they were born. So we have to think about that. So, and this is why we have to be very careful that we have to find a specific target within the millennials. And this is why I will repeat it. We are focusing on young professionals. Definitely, all the research that we have done around millennials is 100% on the money with what we are seeing here today, and definitely the way that we are running business changed with social networks, and we are a B2B company, so we sell our products to the banks, and the banks sell the product to the consumers. Having said that, we had to open our communication and being closer to the consumer, working every single day on new ideas, bringing innovation on how we are going to be engaging these consumers so they can go to the banks and different financial institutions and request a Mastercard. So clearly we are open to that. We had to find changes and innovation, and we are working very hard on that.
Thank you, Guillermo. Mark, do you have a perspective on betterment? All right, we're going to move on to Sachin. Do you agree with the study that future of finance industry will be cashless society? Banks will no longer be affluent millennials' primary financial institutions, and there will be a sharing-based economy?
Hey folks, this is Sachin Reiki. I definitely agree with that. And what I'd say is that not only do I believe this is the future, I actually think in many ways this is already starting to happen. So let me just give you 3 quick examples of how in my own personal life you're starting to see some of those future trends happen today. The first, when you talk about a cashless society, everyone talks about Apple Pay and some of these other digital solutions. But actually, the one I'm most excited about is simply the Starbucks app. They've done an incredible job making a digital cashless experience for me that goes well beyond the payment to a rewards program. And so I think you're going to continue to see those kinds of experiences which I absolutely love. And I can't even remember the last time I even took out my credit card when I was at Starbucks. Similarly, in terms of moving to new financial institutions, I'll talk a bit about this later, but for example, I've already moved my own personal finances away from many of the traditional banks using a service like Wealthfront, which is a robo-advisor, to manage a lot of my assets. So you're already starting to see non-financial service brands start to creep up, and I think that's only going to continue. And finally, on the sharing economy, the best example I can give is my wife and I were just having this discussion recently when she got a new job about whether we should get a second car. And what we ultimately decided was that it made more sense for her to just Uber whenever she wanted to. It was cheaper when it compared to paying for gas and a car and insurance. And so the sharing economy has already had a huge influence on our lives. So I think this future is not only coming, but it's beginning to creep up on us already.
Thank you for that, Sachin. Guillermo, how do your respective companies, Mastercard, envision the future of the finance industry?
Yeah, I would say I would build on the idea of a cashless society. And I think that is so important and so relevant for not only the millennials, but what is going to happen in the world. Mastercard is a company that is fighting every single day against cash because cash is one of the biggest problems that we have in society. Because when you manage cash, it is very complicated for the corporations managing cash. It has a cost when you are managing cash. And on top of that, millennials have it that so clear because it is so much convenient being in a cashless society that we support their vision 100%. We are negotiating with governments around the world. So even though this is a discussion about the U.S. affluent millennials, the importance is that we build a global cashless society. And I agree, there are multiple ways of paying with new technologies, but the role of Mastercard behind that, it's still key on Apple Pay, on Samsung Pay, on any of the different ways, on the Starbucks card, on any of those devices. Behind it, you have a credit card. So you need to have still a form of payment, electronic or physical, at the merchant, at the store. You still need to have the card in the back. So we support the idea of the cashless society 100%. Remember that in the world, cash is still around 75% of all the transactions that happen. Even though in the US it's a little bit lower, but cash is still where we can continue growing our business, but more importantly, improving the way that the society lives, and how do we bring down the cost for all the companies. So we are 100% with the millennials on that.
Thank you, Guillermo. Emily, we saw a lot of entrepreneurial spirit among affluent millennials in the research. What were some key findings there, and how else are we seeing their entrepreneurial spirit?
Yeah, so I think, Mia, got a couple of things that you would hit on, excuse me, earlier in the presentation, mostly that there are 30% of affluent millennials have a goal of starting a business in their future. So I think that was 3 times as likely as affluents in previous generations that we had seen. And on top of that, the fact that they're willing to finance to get there, to get to their goals, with that 35% that have business loans currently. And I think we've seen, there was a Deloitte study recently that had a stat of, I think it was just over half of millennials in all developed countries have already started or plan to start their own business. So I think just seeing that really growing, especially from one affluent generation to the next, has been interesting. And I would definitely be interested to hear Sachin's perspective on that as well, and just kind of his kind of moving into that entrepreneurial spirit side, and kind of what influences he's seen driving that.
Yeah, I guess on that, what I'd say is that, you know, I think there is a lot of entrepreneurial interest and a lot of excitement. And I think it takes many different forms. Part of it is the form when we traditionally think about entrepreneurship in starting your own businesses or those kinds of endeavors. But I think even beyond that, the entrepreneurial spirit shows up in kind of the workday and how we think about taking control of how we manage our own careers. But even when it comes to things like financial services, I think that entrepreneurial spirit shows itself from the perspective of when we choose our financial services, you know, taking a what some might call a risk on a new age technology solution, as opposed to simply trusting a decades old traditional banking brand, is I think something that's very popular with millennials. And I think the success that we've seen in technology has given millennials confidence in new age solutions that I think previous generations may have been more eager to use the tried and true, as opposed to the new and entrepreneurial.
Thank you, Sachin. I actually have a question for you. Do you agree that affluent millennials are soloists, however, want guided, independent expert advice from financial advisors to help your generation make financial decisions?
Definitely. I think that's definitely true. And I think here's the interesting nuance with it. You know, what I found was, in my own experience, for example, talking to a lot of financial advisors, the traditional approach of often what the conversation was that a traditional financial advisor wanted to assure me that they were going to take care of everything for me, that I wouldn't have to worry about the details, that I was in good hands. But I often talked about that as sort of this wine and dine tax, where you had to pay almost to these financial service advisors that were eager to convince you that they were going to take care of everything for you. But actually, what's fascinating is that as a millennial, I'm very interested in understanding the details. I'm very interested in understanding exactly what's going to happen with my money, exactly how it's going to be invested, what exactly is the strategy you're going to employ to help diversify my assets. And it's not that I don't trust your advice, it's that I want to be assured of the details. So that's what's going to build the confidence, as opposed to the traditional mechanisms of sort of just suggesting that you don't have to worry about it and everything's taken care of for you. And so I think what you're seeing now is sort of a new generation of advice that is this independent expert advice that you spoke about earlier, Menika, that millennials value, and they want to understand the details. They want to be very steeped into understanding how their money is being managed, as opposed to just being told it's taken care of.
That's very good insight. I have another one for you. Do you agree with the study that affluent millennials are open to offerings from traditionally non-financial brands and are highly loyal?
I definitely agree with that in terms of folks leveraging non-traditional brands. And so let me talk about why I think that's the case. I think millennials have been through an experience where they've seen in other industries this transformation from traditional leaders to new technology upstarts. So take the media industry, for example. We've seen in music a sort of move away from the big four major labels to online services like Spotify and Apple Music. And we've been very excited about that trend and the capabilities that brings and the great consumer experience that enables for us. Similarly, we've seen the same thing in video with folks like YouTube becoming a brand that we use every single day to engage with video content. And these, are very non-traditional media brands, really technology-first companies that have gotten into very traditional spaces. And I think our excitement for what's happened in just this one sector, media, is something that I think is going to spill over to financial services. And frankly, I think if you were to see these technology brands expand into financial services, I think you'll get a lot of excitement from millennials about them. Things like Apple Pay is a great example where still to be proven on how successful it's going to be, but a lot of brand loyalty to a brand like Apple getting into that space. And so I think there's a lot of excitement there. And on a more personal note, I mentioned earlier that I went through this exercise recently to go through all of my own financial services and revamp them. And through this exercise, I took a step back and looked at every financial service tool I use, from checking accounts to saving accounts to insurance to wealth management, consolidated a bunch of 401ks, rolled them over to IRAs, and was really looking for best-in-class solutions for my needs. And as I did that, I ended up with many non-financial brands. So for example, I mentioned that for wealth management, I'm using a provider called Wealthfront, which is one of these new age robo-advisors. And that was actually a shift away from Vanguard, a very traditional provider. Similarly, to manage my assets, I'm using spending management and wealth management tools like Mint and Personal Capital. Again, very technology-first companies. That being said, there's certainly still traditional banks in my financial stack. I use Chase's Sapphire Preferred Credit Card just because it happens to have great perks for millennials like me that travel a lot, eat out a lot, and they give you kind of higher 2% cash back on dining and travel, which ended up appealing to me. So I'd say that, when looking for solutions, definitely looking for best-in-class solutions that are going to really appeal to my needs, which often look like they're coming from non-financial services brands.
Thank you for that, Sachin. Donna, with your in-depth knowledge of millennials, can you please provide your perspective on affluent millennials' brand loyalty?
Absolutely. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the LinkedIn Affluent Millennial study was how reflective of the generation the findings were. So we did a deep dive into financial services, but as you look across categories and sectors, things like automotive and retail and beauty and entertainment and transportation, and as Sachin's been talking about, I mean, you really do see the impact that the generation is having. Part of what's very different about this generation versus previous generations is that the selection set from which they're choosing their options is much broader. And where previous generations, the Gen Xers, the Boomers, the Silents, really relied on legacy, traditional brands who had a history in a particular industry, for these millennials, some of the most successful brands that they use every day with a high degree of satisfaction have not been in business, 20 years, 30 years. And so, yes, absolutely, affluent millennials can be very brand loyal, but it's not brand loyalty in the same way that previous generations sort of operationalized it. So, for example, if you're looking for a solution for a particular, process or problem that you have, you're looking for a very customized solution, and therefore you could look to new brands. You can look to a new sort of app provider or a new service provider, because that you've been taught sort of your entire life that a company can be new and be much more successful in solving your particular problem than a brand that's been around for a long time that may be offering up, sort of one-size-fits-all solution. So I think one of the things that came out of the study, which we're also seeing across the different studies that we do with this cohort, is that part of what the strategy needs to be is to get in early, to let millennials know about your brand, how you can help them now, and continue to offer services that grow with them as their sort of life needs change. And you see that sort of across the different kinds of brands. So, for example, Sachin brought up, like Apple Music, or, even sort of the iTunes store. Like, that was something that millennials grew up with. They were used to paying real money for virtual goods, if you will, and now they're teaching the next generation, their children, about where to find satisfaction, where to look for, digital entertainment. So if you were a millennial looking for, a particular movie or a television show, you were satisfied by going to iTunes. Now, if your child comes home and wants to watch Doc McStuffins or listen to Laurie Berkner, you can go there and satisfy their needs as well. So that's a brand that's continuing to grow and satisfy the needs of their consumers as consumers change. So for brand loyalty for millennials, communicate, be where they are, get in early, and continue to grow with them.
Thank you, Donna. Guillermo, with 7 out of 10 affluent millennials open to financial solutions from brands outside the finance industry, what type of solutions is Mastercard providing to affluent millennials to acquire and to retain them?
I think that Sachin and Donna's point were very good as a segue into this question. Definitely, we had to change multiple things in the way we communicate with millennials, as I mentioned before. It's not only being in social networks, it's really understanding them and opening a dialogue in which they tell us what they want to talk about. And for example, listening to them. In the past, we have been a very traditional company buying sponsorships, for example. So Champions League, golf. But today, we are investing in SFX and Beatport. SFX is the biggest entertainment company today around dance music, and they are the ones that put together Tomorrowland, Mysteryland, and all these type of incredible events in which millennials participate 100%. That has been a big change within the company. How do we try to retain them and acquire them by also bringing more safety and security into all the transactions that they are doing through our networks. Why? It's important because they are telling us. It is very important to know exactly what is happening. Safety and security are key. And in a world with so many hackers, we are playing a very good role and a very important role in terms of working with our banks on finding new ways on making transactions safe and secure for millennials. We are working now on how do we make possible transactions person to person. That is going to happen in the next couple of, so it's happening in some markets. We are testing some of those things. So biometric solutions. We are already working with Apple Pay on fingerprint solutions and with Samsung Pay. So all these new things that are embraced by millennials are all the things that we are bringing, and on top of that, acquiring some technology companies that already have some of that technology. And so we are really closer to the needs of the millennials, the affluent millennials, and listening to them. So they are telling us what they need and want, and we are really trying to play a good role, an important role on really bringing that to them.
Thank you, Guillermo. Emily, in this research, we saw that affluent millennials are especially active on LinkedIn as they're sharing 13 times as much finance topic articles. From a LinkedIn perspective, how do we see this research findings playing out on LinkedIn's platform?
Yeah, so we saw in the earlier presentation how active they are in terms of sharing content. They're also active on other parts of the platform, but I think the content one was in particular most interesting to us. And I think it was 13 times, they shared 13 times as many finance topic articles as the average audience. So that was interesting for the specific subject matter. But Manika, you'd also mentioned in general that they're looking for content and advice that's relevant to them. It doesn't need to be a specific topic. And I think we've seen that coming out too, just in the breadth of topics that they are interested in terms of not just what they're sharing, but what they're consuming. They're just hungry for content in general. So we see a lot of interest in professional development type topics, so even things around time management, self-esteem, that kind of thing. And then all the way over to personal finance education, so a lot of things around retirement and stuff like that. And they're also still following a lot of traditional financial, both companies and influencers. So we see a lot of followers to places like Wells Fargo, Mastercard, Goldman, but then also people like Mohammed Al-Arian. They're interested in what Sally Krawcheck's saying, things like that that tend to be more on the traditional end. So a lot of places that they're gathering the information that they need to make these kinds of decisions we've been talking about.
Thank you, Emily. Sachin, how do you gather your financial content? Is it primarily on social platforms, or is it speaking with your family and friends and the financial services providers themselves? And does it matter whether you had a previous relationship with the financial services provider?
That's a great question. So let me touch a bit upon how I went through this process most recently through revamping my own finances. And I'd say that it started, frankly, with the age-old thing that everyone does when they have a question, which is opening up Google and starting to type in a keyword to find more information about a topic that I was interested in. So I spent a lot of time Googling on everything from financial topics like how do I pick a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA, and how do I make that decision for me? Should I go and convert my traditional to Roth, and these kinds of things. And as I was Googling, I would find great content from a ton of different sources. Find it on things like financial advisors' websites. I'd find it on third-party financial advice sites. A new one that's coming up very frequently in my searches is NerdWallet, which is a website that provides a ton of financial advice with lots of details about different providers and choices. I even found myself on certain sites like Quora, which is a Q&A service where, for example, Andy Radcliffe, who's the chairman of Wealthfront, was answering my personal questions on things like what's the long-term rate of return I can expect across a diversified set of ETFs that I was investing in. So a lot of it was initially through Google searching, which brought me to a ton of different online providers, sometimes blogs that were really well maintained by providers like Betterment, Wealthfront, and some of the other new age financial services, and sometimes third-party sites that really served as kind of curators of financial advice. So I'd say it started there. Then, you know, I certainly leveraged family and friends to get additional advice. Part of it was, frankly, just seeking out folks that were interested in, you know, that I knew had some proclivity in, you know, being financially savvy. So I just simply email them or call them, or, you know, have a conversation with my parents about how they're using various services. But I have to say that the most scalable approach was certainly using social networks. So I mentioned I wrote a blog post about kind of my choices in financial services. And, you know, as soon as I posted that on Facebook, it had over 100 likes, it had over 30 comments. There was such a rich dialogue with my friends about what services they were using and where they thought they could do better than what some of the services that I was talking about. And it's really this ability for social media to aggregate so many opinions so quickly from people that I trust, people that are like me, and people that have done the research themselves. But what's also been fascinating is the amount of engagement this blog post has gotten. So many of my friends have been like, thank you for doing the work to, you know, help figure out the kinds of things that services that you and me would like to use. And it's really been a way to give back to my own sort of social networks and community on some of the things I've learned in through the process.
Very interesting. Thank you, Sachin. Guillermo, with the finance industry being so highly regulated, how does Mastercard leverage social networks to engage with affluent millennials? And if you're engaging on social networks with affluent millennials, can you share some best practices and some topic of content that you're sharing with affluent millennials?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a very important topic as well. Number one of the first things that we learned is that you are not going to be sending the same message through the different social networks. So it is not the same, the type of message you can manage on Facebook or than the one on Twitter or than the one on Pinterest or than the one on any other social network. So it is important, number one, to define which message and have a strategy for all these different sorry about that, for all these different social networks. So with that, once you have the strategy, you have to define which are the different topics that you're going to be managing on that. You have to have a calendar. Definitely, we already defined which was the target audience because it's the affluent millennials. And then what we have to think is not the old way of trying to sell them something, it's engaging them. And by engaging them is talking about what is important to them. And by thinking about that, one of the best practices, I would say, is when we play on their ideal of social mission that they have. So, and we support a lot of institutions, but one of the best practices in the US is what we do with Stand Up to Cancer, when people eat out and pay with their Mastercards, we bring money to Stand Up to Cancer, up to $2 million, and that is a very good way of seeing how people engage into that, how they participate, how they share the information, because it's about what they are doing. They are helping Stand Up to Cancer. We are just the bridge between the consumer and the institution. So that is a very good best practice that we have. When we play with prices surprises, it's another element in which when we surprise consumers and we bring a smile to their faces and to their lives, it's that idea and positioning of Mastercard of bringing consumers a little bit of prices possibilities every single day. So in making their life a little bit better. And consumers really understand that portion, and they share that when it's about the surprises, when they meet a celebrity, when they can bring friends to participating into different events. And again, as I said before, also having a message for the different social networks. And in social networks, it's about the engagement of the consumer.
Thank you, Guillermo. Sachin, in your opinion, what specific content do affluent millennials want from their financial services providers, and where do they want to find them?
So I think there's a few dimensions of the best kind of content to appeal to affluent millennials. One of the things we talked about earlier was this idea of expert advice. And I think that's a really important one. We want to feel like when we're getting content, we're getting it from a brand, a person that we deem as an expert, for which there's trust built into that. A classic traditional example of this is consumer reports. When you come across a consumer report on anything like electric cars and those kinds of things, you trust the reviews that come back with it. Similarly, something from CNET or any of these other more traditional brands. And so what we're looking for is brands that can help create that kind of trust and expertise. I think people do that different ways. I think some of the new age robo-advisors, for example, are doing that by actually elevating the individual personalities of the folks that are writing for them on their blogs, talking about the individuals. Like Bertrand Miquel, for example, at Wealthfront, or their CEO and those kinds of things, which frankly looks very different than a lot of the other traditional organizations. NerdWallet, for example, is trying to create that expertise and that brand that you trust, that you know anytime you come across NerdWallet content, it's comprehensive, it's up to date, and it's just great financial advice. So I think establishing sort of a brand and expertise around your content, and so it's not just these one-off posts is important. I think the other thing is oftentimes folks are looking for very detailed advice, and they're looking for answers, not just some factors to consider. So for example, one of the things I mentioned was, I was looking for content on a personal decision on whether to go traditional IRA or Roth IRA. And I think from that perspective, I found a lot of traditional providers telling me, here's some factors to think about. But then I found sort of a more useful post that talked about, if you're in this situation, here's the things that may work for you. Or if you're in this situation, here's a better way to think about it. And so I think getting into the weeds of being able to try to make content actionable to the point at which someone can derive a conclusion from it is really important. And I think the third piece is just not fearing sort of giving advice through content away for free. Because I think that's kind of a major strategy, in that you look at even my own use of Wealthfront, they provide all the details I need to go recreate their robo-advisor portfolio on my own. They give me the allocations, they'll even tell me when to rebalance. But that has created such trust in the brand for me that I'm still willing to pay the premium for them to do the work for me and pay that convenience surcharge. But at least I know exactly what's happening, and I feel like the brand is willing to focus on education more so than just simply getting me on as a customer. So I think those are some of the specific attributes that I'd look for in terms of kind of best-in-class content for millennials.
Thank you for that, Sachin. And just with a few minutes left 10 minutes before the end of our webinar, we're going to turn to see if we have any questions from the audience as well. I think the first question I see here is, how do affluent millennials view a topic like insurance, and do new options for major companies make a difference for them? Guillermo or Donna or Sachin, do you have any perspective on that?
Well, I'll start. Any category
that's trying to reach out to millennials, affluent millennials in particular. There are so many different sources of information, and we've been hearing a lot about just the variety of content expertise that exists in the world. Getting on a millennial's radar screen is really the first step, finding out how you can communicate with them, because they have very specific sort of schema in their head about what kind of communication belongs in what kind of environment. And so introducing, whether it's an insurance product, a financial services product, a new retail process, a new automotive product, you really need to start by understanding where do they give you permission and where will they be open to your messaging. And so I think if you can provide a very specific solution to a problem that they're currently facing, that they will be open to it. But the first step in the process is to figure out how do you start that initial dialogue in a way that will have them be receptive to receiving your message.
Yeah, and just to add one specific element is, for example, if we talk about insurance in general, one important element for affluent millennials is that this is the segment, and from a generation perspective, is the generation that is traveling the most, and not only within the U.S., but they are traveling internationally. That is a huge change in the way that millennials are living. They are trying to. They are seekers of new adventures, of experiences. So I think that in terms of credit cards building into insurances for the millennials traveling is key, and that is happening at this time. So I think that more new type of insurances will come, but I think that pointing only on traveling, that is a very interesting portion of the life of the millennials right now.
One thing I might add is that I just went through a process of kind of revamping my insurance products, auto and homeowners insurance. And, insurance is a product that, frankly, you don't really have much engagement with the product. But the two things that ended up being important to me is kind of technology solution. Geico is an interesting one in that they now allow you to take your auto ID cards and no longer have to put them in your car every 6 months. It's actually just available on my iPhone, and here in California, you're allowed to show a policeman just your iPhone app. So that was kind of a fun little feature that was technology forward and kind of convenient for me. So that kind of played a role in my decision. And the second is, the biggest challenge folks have with insurance usually ends up being, at least auto and home, is the claims process. And so I spent time on J.D. Power's reviews of customer satisfaction with the claims process. And this is a case where actually it's more difficult for a new age solution to provide sort of reputation against a great claims process as it is kind of more the traditional providers.
Yeah, and I would only, Guillermo here, I would add only one element. Since millennials so the affluent millennial is so curious, there is a door that is opening to talk about insurances in a different way. In the past, it was very difficult because nobody wants to talk about bad things. So when you talk about insurances, you lost money, you have to deal with death, you have to deal with a car crash, you have to deal with your luggage that was lost. But millennials are curious and they want to know. So if we find ways of communicating the benefits in a way that millennials are requesting, I think that it's a totally different way of communicating with them as companies were doing in the past.
Thank you. And with a few minutes left, we're going to take one more question. This question is, the pace at which technology is changing, do we agree that there will always be a gap between digitally savvy, especially affluent millennial customers, and digital services provided by financial services industry? Guillermo, did you want to take that question first?
Yeah, I think that we have to be realistic. So when we watched movies in the past talking about biometric solutions, or when we talk about fingerprints, those were things that we were thinking about could happen 15 years ago, and today is a reality. It always takes time from the moment that you test something, or you build a concept, and then you test it, and then it goes to the markets, because you have to think that there are millions of regulations that you have to adapt to, that you have to test it enough time to be sure that that is 100% safe and secure for the consumer, and for the consumer to with their accounts. So we always have to be conscious about that. Apple Pay didn't happen overnight. We've been working with Apple for years on that specific product. And everything that is going to happen with biometric, we are already testing things around the world. We are testing multiple things, person-to-person payment. But again, you have to test, learn, and then you can launch this. There is always a gap between a new technology until it can be really multiplied into millions of people using it.
Thank you, Guillermo. Sachin, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I guess what I'd say is that I think the gap is shortening in terms of time frame from sort of new technologies appearing and either new age or traditional financial services leveraging them. And so I think the gap is going to get much smaller. You know, for example, I remember the days when mobile check scanning was sort of only available to a few new age sort of banks, but now obviously every single mobile app that offers, any bank that offers a mobile app has digital check scanning. And that only took, you know, it took several years, but not kind of a crazy amount of time. Similarly, Touch ID as a mechanism on your iPhone to actually authenticate with an app, again, started with sort of the new age financial services, but very quickly, my Chase app allows me to use Touch ID. And so I think that the time period between sort of creation of technology and its use by even traditional financial services is shortening, and I think it's only going to get shorter, which is great for the consumer in the end.
Thank you, Sachin. Well, that's all we have time for today. And we want to thank our speakers, Donna, Emily, Sachin, and Guillermo. And thank you all very much for attending. And once again, you will receive an email within the next 48 hours that will contain access to this webinar recording, presentation, and white paper. And to learn more about marketing on LinkedIn, you can visit marketing.linkedin.com. Please fill out the survey as you log out and have a great rest of your day.